кажется, надавалка. Вчера со мной тусила, сегодня с этим. Вон, на, посмотри.
Ой, беги.
Ты чё? Куда?
Владимир Сергеевич, прошу. Чай, кофе.
Мам, подожди, это просто прикол такой был.
Значит, договорились.
Мам, я дома! Мам! Мам!
Садись.
Извини. Красиво. А зачем мы сюда приехали?
Какая смелая малышка.
Саш, что ты от него ждешь, а?
Чего-нибудь. Помощи, чтобы был рядом.
Он теперь рядом с другой дочкой, с другой женой, понимаешь? Мы ему нахрен не сдались.
Папа поможет, он с врачами договорится.
Саш, да Саш,
Просто попросил.
Да, у нас тоже чисто деловые отношения.
Ну да.
Так, ты мне зубы не заговаривай. Вы погуляли, а потом?
Потом ничего, просто отвез домой и все.
Нет, ну в целом верно. Но для ЕГЭ не пойдет. Так, а ну-ка покажите-ка мне ваши домашние задания.
Айдарова двойка.
Лёш, прости, пожалуйста, я вообще ничего не понимаю в химии.
Привет. Давай, заходи. Что стоишь там?
Какая санкция?
Ну, Барсов, у нас с тобой договор. А ты со своей Викой.
Чего с Викой?
Полин, ну сколько можно тебе говорить? Носи с собой ключи.
Привет, пап.
Согласен.
A promise of protection should make Polina feel safer. Instead, in your heart will be broken, it arrives with conditions. Dima Bars can stand between her and the cruelty of a hostile school, but he also expects obedience in return. The arrangement offers immediate relief while quietly moving control from one pair of hands to another. That contradiction gives this youthful romance its most revealing question. Here at Cinema Deep View, we're looking beyond the attraction between the vulnerable newcomer and the intimidating boy who becomes her unlikely shield. The more important issue is what their bargain teaches Polina to accept. When safety depends on following someone else's rules, is it truly safety? And when dependence begins to feel like affection, how clearly can either person recognize the difference? Your Heart Will Be Broken, released in 2026, enters familiar territory. Polina Tumanova arrives at a new school already carrying the discomfort of someone who knows how quickly a room can decide who belongs. The social order is established before she can find her place within it. Attention becomes exposure, vulnerability becomes entertainment, and the ordinary desire to pass unnoticed proves impossible. Dima, known as Bars, occupies the opposite position. He doesn't need acceptance because his reputation already controls the space around him. That difference creates the film's central attraction. Polina appears to need what Bars possesses: confidence, status, and the ability to make other people retreat. Bars, meanwhile, is drawn toward someone who doesn't fit comfortably into the hierarchy that gives him power. Their connection is not born on equal ground. It begins as an exchange between a person under pressure and a person capable of redirecting that pressure. Romance can make such an imbalance feel exciting. The decisive boy appears dependable because he acts when everyone else watches. His certainty can resemble strength, especially beside adults and classmates who fail to provide meaningful security. Yet decisiveness and respect are not the same quality. A person can protect someone from public humiliation while still limiting her freedom in private. The film's emotional challenge is to determine whether Bars learns that distinction, whether Polina recognizes it, and whether the story itself understands the danger built into their arrangement. This matters because bullying is not only a series of cruel incidents. It changes the victim's sense of what counts as a reasonable choice. When every ordinary option feels unsafe, a restrictive bargain can look like freedom. Polina's decisions therefore cannot be measured as though she were acting without fear. Her attraction, gratitude, defiance, and uncertainty develop inside a social environment that has already narrowed her possibilities. Bars is also more than a romantic fantasy if the film allows his authority to carry consequences. His influence may stop one kind of aggression, but it cannot automatically create trust. Trust requires room for refusal. Affection requires the ability to disagree without losing protection. If those conditions are absent, the relationship risks reproducing the same logic as the school around them. Belonging is granted only when the powerful person approves. The deeper view, then, is not simply whether Polina and Bars fall for each other. It is whether a bond created by unequal power can grow beyond the terms that created it. The film asks us to watch the distance between rescue and possession, between being chosen and being respected, and between the thrilling image of protection and its emotional cost. Before judging where the relationship leads, we first need to understand what kind of romantic experience the film believes it is offering, and what becomes visible when that first impression is tested. Your Heart Will Be Broken presents itself as an intense first love melodrama, built around a combination that is immediately recognizable: the isolated new girl, the feared boy with hidden emotional depth, a hostile school environment, and a protective arrangement that gradually becomes personal. Adapted from Anna Jane's popular novel, the film understands that much of its intended audience arrives not to question these ingredients, but to experience their emotional force in a visible, concentrated form. Its appeal depends on contrast. Polina's uncertainty is placed against Bars's confidence. Her social exposure meets his intimidating reputation. She enters rooms hoping not to be noticed, while he appears able to change the atmosphere merely by being present. That difference produces a fantasy of emotional shelter. The person everyone fears chooses to defend the person everyone else has made vulnerable. For viewers drawn to opposites attract romance, the basic structure delivers an immediate invitation. The film's strongest initial quality is its clarity about Polina's emotional position. She isn't simply a neutral protagonist waiting for romance to begin. She enters the story needing stability, dignity, and some control over how others see her. The hostility she encounters makes every gesture of support feel unusually significant. Because the social environment is so unforgiving, Bars doesn't have to appear conventionally gentle to become attractive. He only has to act when other people remain passive. That is an effective emotional shortcut, and the film uses it confidently. Bars's willingness to intervene separates him from the crowd, while his abrasive manner prevents the relationship from becoming comfortable too quickly. The attraction develops through friction rather than easy compatibility. Polina's resistance gives their exchanges energy, and Bars's authority creates the impression that every encounter could shift from confrontation to intimacy or back again. The principal performances support that tension through difference in rhythm. Veronika Zhuravleva gives Polina a watchfulness that suits someone continually measuring the danger of a social space. Her guarded reactions matter because the character cannot openly express everything she is processing. Daniel Vegas plays Bars with greater physical certainty and deliberate restraint. He often seems less interested in explaining himself than in making his presence understood. Together, those approaches create a readable imbalance before the screenplay fully examines it. For the film's likely audience, that imbalance may be part of the attraction. The story belongs to a tradition of romantic dramas in which emotional risk is inseparable from desire. A dangerous reputation becomes evidence of hidden sensitivity, and controlling behavior is framed as something love might eventually soften. Your Heart Will Be Broken doesn't invent that fantasy, but it commits to it with little embarrassment. Its sincerity is important. The film rarely behaves as though it is standing outside its genre and making fun of the people who enjoy it. That sincerity is also where the first meaningful reservation appears. The movie sometimes relies on the audience's familiarity with the fantasy instead of earning every emotional transition. Bars can be compelling as a screen presence while remaining difficult to accept as a trustworthy partner. Protection, jealousy, command, and care occupy dangerously close positions, and the film doesn't always create enough distance between them. At times, intensity is treated as proof of emotional depth when it should be the beginning of a more difficult examination. The surrounding school conflict presents a similar problem. Its cruelty efficiently places Polina under pressure, but efficiency can flatten the people applying that pressure. When antagonistic classmates function mainly as a machine for humiliation, their behavior risks feeling designed to push Polina toward Bars rather than emerging from a convincing social system. The result strengthens the central romance in the short term while making parts of the world around it feel less dimensional. Still, the film's directness should not be mistaken for complete emptiness. Beneath the heightened behavior is a recognizable adolescent fear. That belonging requires performance. Polina must decide which version of herself will survive in the new environment. Bars must maintain an identity built around authority even when intimacy asks for vulnerability. Their romance becomes engaging when it exposes the cost of those performances, not merely when it rewards their attraction. Viewers who enjoy emotionally heightened young adult romances, volatile chemistry, school rivalries, and protective antiheroes are most likely to connect with the film. Those who need a relationship to demonstrate mutual respect before asking for emotional investment may find the experience more frustrating. The movie is less persuasive as a realistic model of love than as a fantasy about two guarded people testing whether closeness can alter the identities that once protected them. Its first impression is therefore mixed but coherent. The film offers accessible emotion, committed performances, and a central pairing with immediate tension. It also asks the audience to tolerate familiar romantic conventions that occasionally blur concern with possession. Whether that blur becomes meaningful criticism or remains an unexamined genre habit depends on the machinery beneath the romance. That machinery begins with a simple but consequential exchange. Polina needs protection inside a social order designed to isolate her. Bars can provide it, but only on terms that give him influence over her choices. Their bargain doesn't merely bring them together. It creates the engine that turns fear into proximity, proximity into attachment, and attachment into a test neither character can control. The story begins before romance becomes a realistic possibility. Polina Tumanova comes to Yekaterinburg with her mother after a damaging conflict at her previous school. The move carries the promise of a reset, but a reset is useful only when nobody knows the person you used to be. Polina enters her new environment hoping that distance has separated her from the identity forced upon her elsewhere. Instead, she discovers that a new social order can produce the same vulnerability with different faces. Her visible objective is modest: get through school without becoming a target. Beneath that goal is a more difficult desire. Polina wants to belong without performing gratitude for being tolerated. She wants dignity without having to win it through someone else's approval. This is what makes her situation dramatically useful. The story doesn't begin with a character chasing love. It begins with a character trying to preserve enough control over her life to make any independent choice at all. The new school quickly establishes itself as a hierarchy rather than a community. Existing groups have already decided who possesses influence, who follows it, and who can be treated as entertainment. Polina's unfamiliarity makes her visible, while her guarded manner can be misread as weakness or arrogance. Lika Malinovskaya and the classmates around her use that uncertainty to isolate the newcomer. Their bullying matters less as a collection of separate incidents than as a coordinated message. Polina's place will be assigned to her unless she can find enough power to resist. The adults surrounding this world cannot simply solve the problem for her. Even when concern exists, the social violence operates through timing, reputation, and public embarrassment. It can appear insignificant when each action is viewed alone, yet become oppressive through repetition. Reporting one moment doesn't automatically change the structure that produced it. Polina understands that any attempt to defend herself may be turned into further evidence against her. Silence keeps her exposed, while resistance risks attracting more attention. Dima Barsov, known as Bars, appears inside this system as someone whose position is already secure. He is not merely popular. His reputation functions like a warning that travels ahead of him. Students adjust their behavior around his presence because they expect consequences, even when he says very little. This makes him useful to Polina long before he becomes emotionally important. He possesses the one resource she lacks: the ability to stop a hostile situation without asking the group for permission. When Bars intervenes, the film creates its first major reversal. Polina is no longer completely undefended, but her safety has become connected to a person she neither understands nor fully trusts. His attention changes how others see her. That protects her from certain attacks while exposing her to a new kind of scrutiny. She is no longer only the outsider. She is now the outsider associated with the boy whose status makes everyone cautious. The screenplay could have used that intervention as a straightforward rescue, but it complicates the moment through the agreement that follows. Bars offers the appearance of a relationship that can discourage further harassment. In exchange, Polina must accept his rules and respond to his demands. The bargain gives both characters something useful. She receives social protection. He gains access to her time, attention, and choices. What neither admits is that the arrangement also creates repeated reasons for them to remain close. Polina's acceptance is the choice that locks her into the narrative. It would be easy to judge the decision as reckless if the story had not already narrowed her alternatives. She isn't choosing between complete independence and an unequal agreement. She is choosing between continuing exposure and protection with conditions attached. The film's story engine depends on that compromised decision because every later emotional development grows from it. The fake relationship changes the school's response, but it doesn't remove pressure. It reorganizes it. People who previously saw Polina as isolated now interpret her through Bars. Some retreat because of his reputation. Others become more curious, resentful, or determined to test whether the connection is genuine. Protection therefore generates new conflict at the same moment it reduces the old threat. Polina gains status she didn't request, and that status becomes another role she must perform convincingly. Bars also becomes trapped by the arrangement in a different way. His authority depends on consistency. If he publicly claims a protective position and then appears indifferent, the school can read that as weakness. What begins as a practical deal requires him to maintain attention. He must notice where Polina is, respond when she is challenged, and behave as though her treatment matters to him. The performance of concern gradually creates the habits of concern before he is prepared to name them. This is how the screenplay converts an artificial relationship into emotional momentum. Instead of relying only on immediate attraction, it uses repeated proximity. Polina and Bars are forced to observe qualities that their first impressions conceal. She sees that his confidence may be partly constructed and that authority doesn't eliminate emotional insecurity. He encounters resistance from someone who cannot be completely impressed or frightened into agreement. Their arguments become important because each one tests whether their bargain can contain two independent wills. The film also delays intimacy through mistrust. Polina can appreciate an act of protection while questioning the motive behind it. Bars can be drawn to her honesty while reacting badly when that honesty challenges his control. Every movement toward closeness, therefore, carries a reason to pull away. The pattern gives the romance its alternating rhythm: threat, intervention, resistance, temporary understanding, and renewed conflict. When effective, this rhythm creates anticipation. When repeated too mechanically, it exposes how strongly the screenplay depends on misunderstanding to keep the tension alive. A second source of momentum comes from reputation. Polina and Bars aren't meeting as blank individuals. Each carries a story that other people tell about them. Polina is treated as an easy target before classmates know her. Bars is treated as dangerous before Polina understands the experiences beneath that image. Their developing bond threatens both narratives. If Polina becomes more confident, the group loses the version of her it can dominate. If Bars becomes emotionally transparent, he risks losing the hardness that protects his position. The central relationship therefore operates on two levels. On the surface, it is a familiar progression from conflict toward attraction. Underneath, it is a struggle over authorship. Who gets to decide what Polina's protection means? Who defines the rules of the arrangement? Can Bars care for her without treating care as authority? Can Polina accept help without allowing that help to replace her own judgment? These questions give purpose to scenes that might otherwise function only as romantic encounters. The cost of failure grows as the relationship becomes more convincing. At first, Polina risks returning to isolation. Later, she also risks discovering that the person who made her feel secure can become another source of uncertainty. Bars faces a corresponding danger. If he admits genuine attachment, he gives Polina the ability to affect him in ways his public identity is designed to prevent. Both characters gain emotional leverage over the other before either develops the maturity to handle it reliably. Supporting relationships increase that pressure by carrying information, loyalty, envy, and expectation between different parts of the school world. Friends and rivals don't merely surround the central pair. They interpret them, spread judgments, and force private uncertainty into public view. A misunderstanding between Polina and Bars rarely remains private because their supposed relationship has become part of the social order. The school acts like an audience that rewards convincing performances and punishes visible hesitation. This is why the story moves even when the external events are simple. The real engine is the gap between the role Polina and Bars claim to be playing and the emotions that begin to exceed it. Each protective act can be read as duty or affection. Each command can sound like part of the bargain or evidence that Bars cannot separate care from control. Each refusal from Polina can appear defensive while also representing her effort to recover agency. The screenplay keeps the decisive late consequences beyond this spoiler-light view, but its direction is already clear. The fake relationship cannot remain safely fake because the social and emotional benefits become real. Once that happens, the original agreement becomes unstable. Rules that seem tolerable as temporary conditions become harder to accept inside genuine affection. The protection Polina needed at the beginning can no longer be judged only by whether it stops other people from hurting her. It must be judged by what it allows her to become. That brings the narrative to its deeper pressure point. Polina and Bars are not revealed primarily by what they say they want. They are revealed by what they do when protection, pride, fear, and attachment demand different choices. The plot moves because the bargain keeps placing them together. The character story emerges because every new pressure asks whether they will repeat the identities that kept them safe or risk becoming people capable of a more equal connection. Deep View 2 complete, approximately 1,440 words pressure reveals Polina most clearly when every available choice carries a cost. Her visible goal is to survive the new school without repeating what happened before. That goal sounds passive, but it requires constant calculation. She must decide when to remain quiet, when to answer back, when to seek help, and when accepting help might create a different kind of danger. The film places her between exposure and dependence, then measures her character through the compromises she is willing to make. Her less visible need is not simply confidence. Polina needs to recover authorship over her identity. Other students treat her as a role before they understand her, the outsider, the weak newcomer, the convenient target. Her mother's hope for a fresh beginning also carries an implied version of who Polina should become. Bars adds another identity when he places her under his protection. Each role may contain some truth, but none is chosen freely by Polina. Her deeper struggle is to become more than the collection of labels attached to her. This makes her central fear more complicated than fear of humiliation. Public cruelty is painful, yet the greater danger is that repeated humiliation will teach her to see herself through the eyes of the people attacking her. Once that happens, the bully no longer needs to be present. Polina will begin limiting herself, expecting rejection, and mistaking invisibility for safety. The film is strongest when it recognizes that social pressure can continue inside a person long after a confrontation ends. Veronika Zhuravleva communicates this internal pressure through guarded timing. Polina often appears to assess a situation before allowing herself a visible reaction. Her stillness doesn't mean the absence of emotion. It suggests someone trying to prevent emotion from becoming material that others can use against her. When she does answer sharply, the sudden change carries accumulated frustration. The performance works through the tension between restraint and refusal, making Polina feel vulnerable without reducing her to helplessness. The public humiliation that brings Bars into her orbit demonstrates that pattern. Polina is surrounded by people attempting to define the scene for her. Their confidence comes from numbers, familiarity, and the expectation that nobody important will challenge them. Her resistance matters, but the structure is against her until Bars intervenes. The moment provides relief while also exposing the limits of individual courage. Polina can refuse the identity imposed upon her, yet she cannot control whether the group respects that refusal. Bars enters with the opposite problem. His visible goal is to remain the person whose authority is never questioned. He appears to move through school without needing permission, explanation, or emotional approval. That power protects him from the vulnerability Polina experiences, but it also limits the range of behavior he can display. He must maintain the impression that attachment cannot weaken him. Even kindness has to arrive in a form consistent with his harder public image. Daniel Vegas builds Bars around economy. The character's physical certainty often does the work that dialogue might otherwise perform. He occupies space directly, allows pauses to extend, and treats other people's discomfort as something he doesn't need to resolve. This creates charisma because the camera can hold on him without requiring constant action. It also creates unease. The same calm that makes his protection reassuring can make his demands feel difficult to challenge. Bars's hidden need is therefore not to become softer in some vague romantic sense. He needs to learn that care cannot be proven through control. His reputation has taught him that power produces order. If someone is threatened, he can remove the immediate threat. If a situation becomes uncertain, he can impose terms. That method works in the school hierarchy, so he applies it to intimacy. The problem is that a relationship cannot be secured through the same authority used to silence an opponent. His central contradiction is visible in the bargain itself. Bars offers Polina protection, which acknowledges her vulnerability, but the conditions risk denying her independence. He wants to be the person she can rely on while making it difficult for her to choose the terms of that reliance. The film's romantic tension grows from this contradiction because his behavior can feel protective and possessive at the same time. The emotional reading changes depending on which element the scene allows to dominate. Polina is the relationship that best exposes him because she doesn't respond consistently to his reputation. She may need what his influence provides, but need is not admiration. Her resistance denies him the uncomplicated gratitude that would preserve his self-image. When she challenges him, she forces a distinction between being feared and being understood. Bars can control how the school behaves around him, but he cannot command Polina into genuine trust. The closer they become, the more obvious that limitation grows. Bars exposes Polina in return. His attention brings out a boldness that isolation suppresses, but it also tests whether that boldness is genuine or dependent on his presence. When she pushes back against his rules, she is doing more than creating romantic banter. She is trying to establish that protection doesn't purchase ownership. When she accepts his help, the film asks whether she is making a practical decision or surrendering judgment under pressure. Her most interesting moments exist between those interpretations. Lika functions as a more direct opposing force, yet the pressure she represents is larger than one antagonist. She embodies a social system that turns status into permission. Her hostility depends on an audience, on shared assumptions, and on the confidence that Polina's pain will have few consequences. Removing one bully would not automatically remove that environment. The school has already normalized observation without intervention, making passivity part of the antagonism. This is why the surrounding students matter even when they are not fully individualized. Their presence creates the public stage on which Polina and Bars perform their identities. A hostile look, a rumor, or a sudden silence can convert private emotion into social information. The fake relationship must be believable not only to protect Polina, but to preserve Bars's authority. Their classmates become an informal jury, constantly deciding whether the arrangement looks convincing and where weakness might be found. The limitation is that several supporting characters function more efficiently as sources of pressure than as complete people. Lika can feel designed to deliver cruelty at precisely the moment the central romance needs acceleration. Some classmates carry information or provoke conflict without enough independent desire to make their behavior surprising. This narrows the moral world. Instead of showing how ordinary insecurity produces group cruelty, the film sometimes divides the school too neatly between obvious aggressors, passive observers, and the two emotionally privileged leads. Polina's mother offers a different form of pressure because parental concern does not always equal understanding. The move is supposed to create distance from earlier pain, but physical relocation cannot erase the emotional consequences Polina carries. A parent may focus on practical stability while missing the social calculations occurring inside school. This creates a familiar adolescent isolation. Polina is not literally alone, yet she feels that explaining everything would either create more trouble or reveal more vulnerability than she can tolerate. The film's character design repeatedly connects power with performance. Polina performs endurance so that cruelty doesn't appear to defeat her. Bars performs indifference so that attachment cannot be used against him. Lika performs dominance because social influence must be continually demonstrated. Even the supposed romance begins as a performance intended for an audience. Every major character is protecting an image, and pressure becomes dangerous when maintaining that image matters more than recognizing another person's reality. The central performances are most effective when they allow those images to crack without collapsing completely. Zhuravleva lets Polina's confidence arrive unevenly, which prevents growth from feeling instantaneous. Vegas gives Bars flashes of uncertainty without removing the authority that defines him. Their chemistry depends less on softness than on mutual interruption. Each character disrupts the role the other has learned to play. That is also where the film's deeper argument begins to emerge. Pressure doesn't simply reveal a hidden, authentic self waiting underneath. It creates habits. Polina's defensiveness and Bars's control are not costumes they can remove as soon as attraction appears. They are survival strategies that have become identities. Love may give them a reason to change, but it cannot do the changing for them. The decisive question is therefore not whether Bars can defeat the people threatening Polina. He clearly possesses enough social power to alter their behavior. The real test is whether he can stop using power as the only language of care. and whether Polina can accept closeness without abandoning the independence she is trying to rebuild. Their choices under pressure lead toward a pattern beneath the romance. In this film, almost every promise of belonging arrives with an unspoken demand to become someone else. On the surface, Your Heart Will Be Broken is about a hostile beginning turning into first love. Polina arrives as an outsider, Bars becomes her unlikely protector, and the distance between performance and genuine feeling gradually narrows. Beneath that familiar progression, the film is organized around a more unsettling pattern. Nearly every form of belonging is offered as a contract. To be accepted, protected, feared, or loved, a character must perform the identity that grants access to that position. The school introduces this logic before Bars formalizes it. Its social groups have rules that nobody needs to write down. Students understand who may speak, who receives attention, who can become a target, and what kind of behavior keeps a person safely inside the group. Lika's influence depends on these shared expectations. Her cruelty succeeds not simply because she acts, but because others know what role they are expected to play around her. Some support her, some observe, and some protect themselves through silence. Polina disrupts that arrangement by arriving without an assigned place. Her difference creates uncertainty, and the group resolves uncertainty by placing her below everyone who already belongs. Bullying becomes a crude method of social classification. It tells Polina that acceptance will require either submission or access to greater power. The film's romantic premise emerges from that trap. Bars doesn't remove the contract. He gives Polina a competing one. His offer is emotionally attractive because its terms appear clearer. The school's cruelty is unstable and public. Bars's protection is direct and personal. One social structure humiliates Polina for being powerless, while the other promises to make her untouchable. Yet both initially define security through someone else's authority. Polina can escape the first hierarchy only by entering a private relationship shaped by the strongest person inside it. This creates the film's deepest thread. Protection and possession can resemble each other when viewed from outside. Both may involve attention, proximity, intervention, and the desire to keep another person from harm. The difference lies in whether the protected person retains the freedom to refuse. Genuine care expands someone's ability to choose. Possession restricts choice while describing the restriction as care. The romance remains compelling because Bars's behavior moves between those possibilities rather than fitting cleanly into one. The nickname Bars becomes important within this interpretation. A nickname built around reputation turns Dima into a public figure before he can be encountered as a private person. Bars is the identity the school recognizes, dangerous, controlled, and socially dominant. Dima is the person Polina may gradually discover beneath that identity. The distinction is not a simple revelation that the intimidating boy is secretly gentle. It is a conflict between the persona that gives him power and the vulnerability that intimacy requires. Polina also possesses multiple identities, though none gives her the same protection. She is the daughter carried into a new beginning, the newcomer watched by unfamiliar classmates, the target defined by humiliation, and eventually the girl associated with Bars. Each version is produced through another person's perception. Her growth depends on whether she can connect those fragments into a self that doesn't disappear when attention changes. The title's promise of a broken heart therefore reaches beyond romantic disappointment. A heart can break when affection fails, but identity can also fracture when a person must continually become different versions of herself to survive. Polina's emotional risk is not only that Bars may hurt her, it is that she may confuse the security of being chosen with the freedom of being known. If she accepts his version of her because it is kinder than the school's version, she may still remain dependent on an external definition. This is where control intersects with desire. Bars's authority is part of what makes him attractive within the film's romantic language. His certainty creates momentum. He acts while others hesitate, and his willingness to confront hostility offers relief from a world where adults and peers fail to provide reliable safety. The movie asks the viewer to desire that certainty before examining its cost. We are encouraged to experience his power as both fantasy and warning. One way the film gives this conflict visible form is through space. School corridors, classrooms, and shared social areas are not neutral locations. They become stages where reputation can be observed. Polina's isolation is strongest when there are people around her because the crowd confirms that her vulnerability is public. Bars changes these spaces by entering them. The behavior of others adjusts, and Polina's position within the frame of the group changes with him. The spatial shift is seductive because it makes protection instantly visible. When Bars stands near Polina, she occupies a different social position even if nothing inside her has changed. That contrast demonstrates both the value and the weakness of borrowed power. His presence can alter the room, but it cannot permanently rebuild her confidence. The moment he is absent, the question returns: does Polina possess greater agency, or has she simply acquired a stronger representative? The motorcycle imagery associated with Bars extends the same idea in another direction. It suggests speed, escape, danger, and control over movement. For a character trapped inside school routines and social observation, movement carries romantic promise. To leave the controlled environment with someone who seems unafraid can feel like freedom. Yet a vehicle also reminds us that freedom depends on who determines the direction. Escape is not identical to agency when only one person is steering. This doesn't make every romantic image secretly harmful. The film allows genuine tenderness to develop through shared attention, changing reactions, and moments when the performance of the arrangement becomes less important than the people inside it. Bars is not compelling merely because others fear him. He becomes compelling when his certainty gives way to listening, hesitation, or concern that cannot be reduced to reputation. Polina's affection becomes convincing when it grows from recognition rather than gratitude. Still, the movie remains productively uncertain about how much transformation the relationship actually achieves. A generous reading sees the bargain as an imperfect beginning that exposes both characters to the changes they need. Bars learns that care demands vulnerability. Polina discovers that receiving help doesn't have to erase strength. Their initial imbalance becomes the condition they must outgrow. A more skeptical reading sees the romance preserving its imbalance while presenting increased emotion as evidence of equality. Bars may become more attached without becoming less controlling. Polina may become more assertive while still operating inside circumstances he defines. From this angle, the film's intensity softens behavior that deserves firmer examination. The relationship changes how the control feels without fully changing who possesses it. The film doesn't settle that tension through a single statement, and that uncertainty is more interesting than a simple moral answer. First love often arrives before people have developed a clear language for boundaries, responsibility, or emotional dependence. Care can be sincere and still be expressed badly. Someone can make another person feel safer while also expecting too much in return. Recognizing the harm doesn't require denying the feeling, and recognizing the feeling doesn't erase the harm. What your heart will be broken asks the viewer to forgive is therefore central to its meaning. Are Bars's demands temporary evidence of immaturity, or are they a romanticized pattern the story fails to challenge? Is Polina's acceptance an understandable response to pressure, or does the film rely too heavily on vulnerability to make the arrangement believable? Different viewers may answer according to what they value most: the emotional sincerity of the connection or the ethical shape of the behavior. The most human aspect of this conflict is the temptation to accept conditional belonging when unconditional belonging feels unavailable. People don't always choose unequal relationships because they mistake inequality for perfection. Sometimes they choose them because the alternative appears to be isolation. The film's social world makes that temptation visible. Polina's task is not merely to recognize that she deserves better treatment. She must believe that dignity is worth protecting even when it threatens the connection she has come to value. Bars faces the opposite task. He must discover whether he can remain present without making presence a form of authority. If he can protect Polina only when she follows his conditions, then the protection is partly about preserving his own importance. If he can accept her refusal, uncertainty, and independence, then care begins to separate itself from possession. This interpretation becomes clearer when individual scenes are examined not for what happens in them, but for how they position the viewer. The public confrontation, the negotiation of the relationship, and the quieter moments in which performance briefly falls away each place protection, control, and desire in a different balance. Looking closely at their staging reveals whether the film merely tells us the characters are changing or allows us to feel that change through image, distance, silence, and reaction. The public humiliation that establishes Polina's vulnerability is effective because the scene is built around spectatorship. The cruelty directed at her matters, but the classmates watching are equally important. Polina isn't only being mistreated. She's being turned into an image that the group can consume, repeat, and use as proof of its own power. The presence of a phone intensifies that violation by creating a second audience beyond the immediate space. This changes the meaning of the group's staging. Polina is surrounded, while the aggressors behave as though the location already belongs to them. Their confidence comes from controlling where she can stand, how much space she occupies, and what everyone else is expected to see. The attempted humiliation is designed to reduce her physically as well as socially. Making someone lower herself in front of witnesses converts an ordinary school area into a temporary court where popularity pretends to be authority. The scene doesn't require graphic detail because its force comes from duration and exposure. The longer Polina remains the focus of collective attention, the more difficult it becomes for her to respond without feeding the spectacle. If she reacts emotionally, the group receives the performance it wants. If she remains still, they interpret silence as permission. The scene traps her between two readings, allowing the viewer to understand why individual bravery cannot easily defeat coordinated humiliation. Bars's arrival reorganizes the space before it resolves the incident. The attention that was fixed on Polina shifts toward him. This is crucial. He doesn't initially restore a fair social environment, he replaces one center of authority with another. The aggressors retreat because they recognize his status, not because they suddenly recognize Polina's humanity. The scene offers emotional satisfaction while quietly preserving the hierarchy responsible for the problem. That double effect shapes our first response to Bars. We experience relief because his presence interrupts harm. At the same time, the speed with which the group adjusts reveals how much power he already holds. The filmmaking invites us to feel the attraction of decisive intervention, but the staging shows that Polina remains dependent on someone else's position. Her body is no longer the center of the spectacle, yet she still hasn't gained control over the room. Performance timing completes the idea. Polina's reaction to being defended cannot be reduced to simple gratitude. Relief mixes with embarrassment because Bars witnesses the position in which others have placed her. Veronika Zhuravleva allows that discomfort to remain present rather than turning the moment into immediate romantic recognition. Daniel Vegas, by contrast, gives Bars the certainty of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Their emotional rhythms are already different, and that difference becomes the foundation of the relationship. The negotiation that follows places the same imbalance into a quieter form. The surrounding crowd is no longer the main pressure, yet its influence remains inside the conversation. Bars can offer protection only because everyone knows what association with him means. Polina can consider the arrangement only because the earlier humiliation has demonstrated the cost of remaining exposed. The absent students still shape the exchange. This scene works as a test of conversational control. Bars establishes terms as though emotion can be organized through rules. His manner turns a supposed romantic performance into something closer to an agreement between unequal parties. Polina's replies interrupt that certainty. She challenges the assumption that help entitles him to command her, even while recognizing the practical value of what he offers. The scene gains energy from the fact that neither character can fully reject the other's logic. The camera's most important task here is not to make the pair look romantic. It is to preserve the changing distance between them. A wider view emphasizes the practical nature of the bargain and the space each character is defending. Closer attention to their faces allows small reactions to complicate what they say. Bars may present confidence, yet a pause can suggest curiosity or surprise when Polina resists. Polina may speak defiantly, while a delayed response can reveal that she is still calculating the risk. Silence has particular value because the agreement is really about what neither character says. Polina cannot openly admit how badly she needs the harassment to stop without exposing the depth of her fear. Bars cannot explain why protecting her matters without weakening the image of indifference that supports his authority. Their pauses contain those concealed motivations. The romance begins not in a declaration, but in the pressure surrounding an incomplete negotiation. The editing benefits when it avoids resolving every exchange too quickly. A reaction held for an extra moment allows the viewer to notice that the practical deal has already created personal interest. Bars is no longer responding only to a social problem. He is observing Polina's refusal to become predictable. She is no longer seeing only the school's feared outsider. She is trying to determine whether the person behind the reputation is safer than the reputation itself. Scenes involving Bars's motorcycle extend the negotiation into visual movement. Within the school, Polina is trapped by other people's attention. Around the motorcycle, the film can offer speed, distance, and temporary escape from fixed social positions. The image carries an immediate romantic charge because Bars appears capable of taking Polina beyond the environment that has classified her. The design also preserves the central imbalance. Bars controls the machine and therefore the direction. Polina may experience release, but it is a release provided by him. Physical closeness becomes necessary, allowing the film to convert movement into intimacy without requiring the characters to articulate what has changed. The engine's sound can temporarily replace dialogue, giving both characters permission to feel connected without openly discussing the conditions of that connection. The contrast between the noisy machine and quieter pauses around it matters more than speed itself. Movement supports the fantasy of escape. Stillness asks what happens when the fantasy stops. When the characters are no longer protected by motion, their posture, eye contact, and hesitation must carry the emotional work. Bars's confidence becomes less absolute in private, while Polina's guardedness can soften without disappearing. These three situations reveal a progression. In the humiliation scene, Polina is placed within someone else's spectacle. During the bargain, she negotiates inside terms shaped by someone else's power. In the more private encounters, she begins to test whether proximity can become mutual rather than transactional. The plot advances through events, but the emotional movement occurs through changes in who controls the space and who is allowed to refuse. The scenes also answer the deep view question in stages. Bars's intervention protects Polina but doesn't free her. The agreement offers security but limits equality. Their quieter connection suggests that genuine feeling might transform the arrangement, yet feeling alone cannot erase its origins. The film becomes most persuasive when its framing, performance, and silence allow all three truths to exist together. Looking closely exposes both the strength and the risk of the movie's romantic design. It knows how to make authority visually attractive. A crowd retreats, a threatening space opens, and movement replaces confinement. The remaining question is whether the broader craft continues examining that attraction or simply decorates it. That answer depends on how direction, cinematography, editing, design, and sound converge around the same emotional pressure. The film's central effect is created through convergence. It makes social power feel physically present, then uses the same cinematic language to make that power romantically attractive. Direction, framing, editing, performance, design, and sound are not operating as separate displays of technique. They repeatedly work toward one sensation. Bars changes the emotional temperature of a space, and Polina feels that change before she can decide what it means. Mikhail Vaynberg's direction treats the school as a network of observation. Corridors, classrooms, and shared areas carry the tension of places where privacy is difficult to protect. A student's reaction can become public information almost immediately. This allows apparently ordinary spaces to feel unstable without requiring constant dramatic action. The possibility of being watched is enough to alter how Polina moves, where she looks, and how carefully she responds. The production design supports this pressure by emphasizing the order already present in the environment. The school is not a chaotic wilderness. It is organized, populated, and socially legible. That matters because Polina's mistreatment doesn't arise from a lack of structure. It arises from an unofficial structure existing beneath the official one. The clean familiarity of the setting makes the hostility more uncomfortable. The environment looks functional while failing to provide meaningful safety. Framing turns this social order into visible relationships. Polina is often most vulnerable when the image must account for other people around her. The surrounding students create lines of attention that point toward her, converting group presence into pressure. A close view can isolate her emotional reaction, but a wider composition reminds us that the reaction has an audience. The film moves between those scales to connect private feeling with public exposure. Bars is framed differently because his presence simplifies crowded spaces. When he becomes the focus, attention consolidates instead of scattering. Other characters react to him with less uncertainty, as though his reputation has already supplied the meaning of the shot. This visual directness gives him charisma. The audience understands his authority before learning much about his interior life. The performances complete that contrast. Zhuravleva's Polina absorbs information from the environment. Her eyes and pauses make the surrounding space feel active because she appears to be measuring it. Vegas's Bars projects information outward. His posture tells others how much room he expects, while his restrained delivery suggests that explanation would be unnecessary. One performance receives pressure, the other generates it. When they share the frame, the film's romantic language comes from the meeting of those two energies. Polina's alertness makes every small shift in Bars visible. Bars's stillness gives her resistance something firm to push against. The chemistry is not created only through affectionate moments. It emerges from the sense that each character is trying to read a person whose defensive method contradicts their own. Editing converts that difference into rhythm. Public conflict tends to move according to reaction. An action occurs, the group registers it, Polina responds, and the social meaning spreads. The cutting can make humiliation feel collective because no single aggressor contains the entire threat. The scene exists through a chain of participation. Even a silent observer becomes part of the emotional construction when the edit gives that observation weight. In the quieter exchanges between Polina and Bars, the rhythm can slow enough for uncertainty to become visible. A pause before a reply matters because the relationship is built on concealed motives. Both characters frequently say less than they feel, so the edit must allow faces and silence to continue the conversation. If it cuts too quickly, the exchange becomes simple argument. When it waits, resistance and attraction can occupy the same moment. This approach helps the screenplay because the underlying structure is highly familiar. The fake relationship, the intimidating protector, the targeted newcomer, and the movement from hostility toward affection are recognizable devices. Surprise cannot come entirely from what happens. It must come from how the emotional balance changes inside expected situations. Performance and editing provide those smaller reversals. A command produces resistance, an intervention creates suspicion, or a confident pose briefly gives way to concern. The screenplay's repeated confrontations also create a pressure and release pattern. A social threat narrows Polina's options. Bars intervenes or draws her into his orbit. Their private exchange releases the external danger while creating new interpersonal tension. The story then allows a softer moment before another disruption tests what has developed. This cycle gives the movie forward movement even when the larger trajectory is predictable. Its weakness is that the pattern can become visible. When every conflict appears time to force the central pair closer or pull them apart, the world begins to feel arranged around the romance. Supporting characters risk becoming switches that activate the next emotional state. The craft often makes individual moments engaging, but the accumulation can reveal the screenplay's machinery. Sound helps disguise and sometimes deepen that machinery. School noise creates social density. Voices, movement, and the restless activity of shared spaces suggest that Polina rarely has complete control over what others hear or see. A sudden reduction in that background can make Bars's arrival feel more forceful because attention seems to narrow around him. The audience experiences his authority as a change in the sound field, not merely as information about his reputation. The motorcycle provides a different sonic identity. Its engine carries confidence, motion, and mild threat. The sound announces bars before intimacy has given him a gentler language. For Polina, that sound can represent escape from the school's enclosed attention. For the film, it fuses danger with mobility, allowing the same element to excite and unsettle. Music participates in the romance by guiding the viewer from confrontation toward emotional recognition. The important question is whether the score leaves enough room for discomfort. If music immediately softens a controlling gesture, it can instruct the audience to accept what the scene has not ethically resolved. When the soundtrack remains restrained, the ambiguity survives, and viewers can feel attraction without being told that attraction cancels concern. Costume contributes to the social shorthand. Bars's harder styling extends the mythology of the dangerous boy and visually separates him from the institutional environment. Polina's presentation supports her position as someone who hasn't yet mastered or accepted the school's codes. These choices are efficient because they allow the audience to read status and difference immediately. Their limitation is the same as their strength. Familiar imagery can turn people into types before performance restores complexity. The film's visual polish generally favors accessibility over severe realism. Emotional states are legible, romantic tension is clearly shaped, and the central pair receive the attention required to carry a heightened young adult melodrama. That clarity makes the story easy to enter. It can also smooth over contradictions that deserve greater resistance. A beautifully composed protective gesture may feel persuasive before its conditions have been questioned. The most successful convergence occurs when form and argument pull in different directions at once. Bars is allowed to look commanding, while Polina's reaction preserves doubt. Movement can feel liberating, while the composition reminds us who controls it. Closeness can be romantic, while a pause reveals that trust remains incomplete. Those moments respect the viewer enough to maintain two emotional truths. The weaker moments occur when every department pushes toward the same uncomplicated response. If framing idealizes Bars, music confirms tenderness, editing removes hesitation, and the screenplay rewards his behavior immediately, the film stops examining power and begins decorating it. The romance becomes smoother, but the deeper question becomes less demanding. Overall, the craft supports the movie's argument when it makes protection feel desirable without making it innocent. The direction understands how status alters space, the performances give inequality an emotional rhythm, and the soundscape connects danger with escape. The film's formal systems are less convincing when they treat attraction as sufficient proof of growth. That tension between examination and decoration leads directly to the movie's friction. The very fantasy that gives it emotional force is also what prevents it from confronting its central imbalance as fully as it could. The film's most consequential weakness is not that Bars behaves imperfectly. Imperfection is necessary for the relationship to have somewhere to go. The problem is that the movie sometimes asks romantic intensity to perform the work of moral development. Bars becomes more emotionally invested, and the increased feeling is treated as evidence that his controlling instincts have softened. Attachment, however, doesn't automatically produce respect. A person can care deeply while continuing to limit someone else's freedom. That distinction matters because Polina's vulnerability is the condition that makes their arrangement possible. She doesn't accept Bars's rules from a position of equal power. She accepts them after the school environment has demonstrated how unsafe isolation can become. The film understands this pressure well enough to make her decision believable, yet it doesn't always remain equally alert to the responsibility that pressure places on Bars. His protection gains emotional value, while its conditions can fade into the background as attraction grows. The result is a recurring imbalance in how consequences are distributed. Polina must continually assess danger, reputation, dependence, and emotional uncertainty. Bars often receives the more flattering dramatic position. He acts, intervenes, sets terms, and becomes the source of movement. Even when his behavior creates tension, the narrative energy surrounding him can make that tension feel exciting before Polina's discomfort has been fully considered. This doesn't make the romance impossible to engage with. It makes the film's point of view unstable. At its best, the movie recognizes that Bars must learn the difference between defending Polina and deciding for her. At weaker moments, it seems satisfied that his possessiveness proves the depth of his feelings. The viewer is left to perform ethical analysis that the screenplay only partially develops. The strongest defense of this choice is that the story is representing adolescent emotion from inside its own intensity. First love rarely arrives with perfect language, mature boundaries, and balanced self-awareness. Young people can mistake jealousy for devotion or certainty for safety because those feelings are easier to recognize than mutual responsibility. From this perspective, Bars's controlling behavior is not a model offered for imitation. It is evidence of a person who has learned to express care through the only form of power he understands. That defense becomes stronger when Polina resists him. Her refusal to respond with uncomplicated gratitude prevents the film from entirely endorsing his behavior. Their arguments expose the gap between what Bars believes he is offering and what Polina actually needs. The relationship's friction can therefore be read as criticism built into the romance rather than a failure outside it. Even so, criticism requires more than disagreement. It requires consequences that force a character to recognize what their behavior costs. The film sometimes moves from conflict back toward attraction before that recognition has fully settled. Emotional chemistry becomes a bridge over unresolved problems. Viewers already invested in the pairing may accept the passage, while more skeptical viewers will notice that the same imbalance remains beneath the softer mood. A smaller limitation is the thinness of the surrounding social world. Lika and the students participating in Polina's humiliation create immediate antagonism, but their behavior can feel too perfectly designed to justify Bars's intervention. When cruelty is concentrated in obvious villains, the story avoids examining the more ordinary mechanisms that allow bullying to continue. Fear of exclusion, competition for approval, imitation, adult inattention, and the gradual normalization of small acts. More developed supporting characters could have complicated Polina's choices. A friend who wants to help but fears becoming a target would reveal the cost of solidarity. An aggressor whose insecurity is visible without excusing the harm would make the hierarchy feel less mechanical. An adult who genuinely tries but misunderstands the problem could demonstrate why institutional responses often fail. Instead, several secondary figures mainly deliver pressure or information when the central romance requires it. This simplification affects pacing as well as character. The movie can move quickly from one heightened incident to another because supporting figures don't need much independent development. That keeps the romance prominent, but it also creates an arranged quality. Conflict arrives with clear dramatic purpose, temporary relief follows, and another disruption appears when the central pair begin to settle. The emotional pattern is readable enough that surprise becomes difficult. Again, there is a reasonable defense. Your Heart Will Be Broken is not attempting a complete social study of school bullying. It is a heightened melodrama focused on the emotional fantasy of a feared boy choosing to protect a targeted girl. Expanding every classmate and adult might dilute the directness that the intended audience values. The film's simplicity gives its feelings speed, and that speed is part of its accessibility. The question is whether this limitation destroys the experience. It does not. The lead pairing retains enough tension to carry the predictable structure, and the film's sincerity prevents the familiar devices from feeling entirely cynical. Polina's emotional position remains understandable. Bars has a compelling screen presence, and their interactions generate momentum even when the plot around them feels constructed. The flaws are better described as inseparable from the movie's appeal. The same decisive authority that makes Bars romantically exciting produces the ethical imbalance. The same concentrated hostility that makes his protection satisfying flattens the school environment. The same rapid emotional rhythm that keeps the story accessible prevents some conflicts from developing the weight they deserve. For viewers drawn to the fantasy, these problems may be tolerable because the movie delivers the desired emotional contrast with confidence. For viewers more concerned with how romance frames power, they will be central. The film doesn't fail because it portrays an unequal beginning. It weakens because it sometimes treats increased affection as though equality has already been achieved. That friction gives the movie more to discuss than a completely polished romance might offer. Its limitations expose the cultural tradition it belongs to, stories where danger, dominance, rescue, and desire are combined into a single romantic figure. To understand why this formula remains effective, and why audiences continue negotiating with its contradictions, the film must be placed within the wider history of young adult melodrama and the protective antihero fantasy. Your Heart Will Be Broken belongs to a romantic tradition much older than its school setting. The fantasy that the person most capable of causing fear may become uniquely gentle with one chosen individual. The dangerous boy is attractive not because danger disappears, but because affection appears to redirect it. His power remains visible to everyone else while becoming protection for the heroine. That contrast has fueled novels, television dramas, and youth romances across many cultures. The film's specific version comes from Anna Jane's best-selling Russian novel. That literary origin helps explain why the narrative privileges heightened emotional situations over strict social realism. The story is built around recognizable romantic types, sharp reversals, rivalry, public humiliation, and private vulnerability. These elements work efficiently in fiction because they allow readers or viewers to experience emotional danger without facing its real-world uncertainty. Adapting such material creates a difficult balance. Fans of the novel usually want the film to preserve the qualities that made the relationship compelling. Bars's authority, Polina's resistance, the charged confrontations, and the gradual shift from arrangement to attachment. A filmmaker who significantly softens Bars may produce a healthier dynamic while removing the fantasy's intensity. A filmmaker who preserves him exactly risks presenting control with too little critical distance. The movie largely chooses preservation. It treats the central romance sincerely and allows the familiar tropes to operate at full emotional volume. That decision makes the film accessible to viewers already comfortable with young adult melodrama. It also means that audiences approaching it as a realistic account of relationships may respond very differently from those approaching it as a heightened fantasy. This difference helps explain the divided reception. The film found a substantial audience and performed strongly in its domestic theatrical market, demonstrating that Anna Jane's readership could translate into cinema attendance. Its popularity also led to plans for a continuation based on the next part of the story. Commercially, the emotional formula clearly connected with viewers who wanted to see these characters embodied on screen. Critical responses were more mixed. Some reviewers recognized the film's direct appeal to teenage audiences and readers familiar with the source. Others criticized its reliance on established clichés, unfinished supporting threads, and an artificial world arranged around romantic escalation. Both responses can be true. A movie may deliver exactly what its intended audience desires while remaining limited in structure, characterization, or thematic depth. The film also arrives at a time when romantic dominance is being read more critically than in earlier youth dramas. Viewers now have a broader public language for discussing consent, boundaries, emotional manipulation, bullying, and unequal power. Behavior once accepted as evidence of passion is more likely to be questioned. This does not eliminate the attraction of the protective antihero, but it changes the conversation surrounding him. That cultural shift makes Polina's resistance especially important. If the story only rewarded Bars for possessing power, it would feel trapped inside an older romantic framework. By allowing Polina to challenge his terms, the film acknowledges that protection cannot be the final form of intimacy. The question is whether it develops that challenge far enough or simply uses resistance to make the courtship more exciting. Compared with darker stories about adolescent life, Your Heart Will Be Broken is less interested in observing teenagers with uncomfortable realism than in translating emotional states into visible melodrama. Social hostility is concentrated, attraction is intensified, and identity shifts rapidly under romantic pressure. The world feels closer to a young person's emotional imagination than to a documentary account of school life. That choice has value. Adolescence often feels larger from inside than it appears from outside. A rumor can seem permanent, a public embarrassment can reshape an entire week, and one person's attention can appear capable of transforming the future. Melodrama respects the scale of those feelings instead of reducing them to immaturity. The film's sincerity toward its audience may be one reason it connected so strongly despite critical reservations. Its wider significance therefore lies less in originality than in timing. It demonstrates that the bad boy romance remains powerful even when contemporary audiences are more aware of its risks. Viewers do not necessarily accept every behavior simply because they enjoy the fantasy. Many can hold attraction and criticism together, responding to Bars's charisma while questioning the terms of his protection. The movie becomes more interesting when understood as a negotiation between those responses. It preserves the emotional architecture of a popular romantic archetype while entering a culture increasingly unwilling to treat possession as devotion without discussion. Its success suggests that the archetype has not disappeared, it has become a site of argument. That argument returns us to the film's specific choices. Polina's vulnerability, Bars's reputation, the fake relationship, and the school hierarchy are not merely borrowed genre devices. They are the mechanisms through which an older romantic fantasy confronts newer expectations about agency. To see how intentionally the adaptation shaped that balance, the next step is to examine the verified production decisions behind the cast, source material, direction, and continuation of the story. The most important production fact is that Your Heart Will Be Broken is an adaptation of Anna Jane's novel rather than an original screenplay conceived as a self-contained film. That origin explains both the strength of its central fantasy and the compression surrounding it. The relationship between Polina and Bars arrives with an existing readership, established expectations, and a much larger amount of interior and supporting material than a feature-length adaptation can comfortably preserve. This changes how the movie's familiarity should be read. The fake relationship and protective antihero are not random shortcuts selected only because they are popular screen devices. They belong to the emotional architecture that made the source novel successful. The adaptation's challenge was not to disguise those conventions, but to translate the attraction readers had already found in them. Its sincerity toward the material is therefore a deliberate advantage, even when it limits how critically the film treats the fantasy. Mikhail Vaynberg directed the adaptation, placing the film's emphasis on readable emotion and the central pairing rather than attempting a radical reinvention of the source. That choice makes the movie accessible to viewers who haven't read the novel while preserving enough intensity to address its established audience. It also helps explain why the school environment is shaped efficiently around Polina and Bars. The film prioritizes their changing emotional distance over a detailed portrait of every supporting relationship. Veronika Zhuravleva was cast as Polina, while Daniel Vegas took the role of Bars as a major screen introduction. The contrast between relative familiarity and newcomer energy benefits the pairing. Zhuravleva gives Polina a stable emotional point of view through which the audience can enter the heightened world. Vegas's less familiar presence supports Bars's mythology because viewers encounter the actor and the character with fewer established expectations. That casting decision affects how Bars is read. His appeal depends heavily on immediate presence, posture, and chemistry, rather than on an audience bringing affection from an earlier role. The film must build his reputation within its own images. This makes the reactions of other students especially important. They teach the viewer how Bars functions socially before the screenplay reveals much about him privately. The film opened in Russia on March 26, 2026. And its strong theatrical performance confirmed that interest in Anna Jane's work extended beyond book sales. It led the domestic box office during its opening period and continued attracting enough attention to turn the adaptation into more than a one-off experiment. That reception helps explain why the movie confidently preserves genre conventions that some critics considered outdated. The intended audience responded to the emotional formula rather than rejecting it for familiarity. A continuation, titled Through the Fragments of Your Heart, was subsequently announced, drawing from the next part of Anna Jane's story. This production decision matters because it confirms that the first film is only one movement in a longer character arc. Some unresolved emotional threads may be intentional foundations for later development rather than accidental omissions. That context does not excuse incomplete storytelling. A film still needs to provide a satisfying dramatic shape within its own duration. It does, however, change how we interpret the relationship's unfinished growth. Polina and Bars are not necessarily presented as having solved the tension between protection and control. Their progress may be provisional, leaving later consequences to test what this first chapter only establishes. Together, these facts reveal a production built around continuity between page, audience, and screen. The filmmakers preserved the source's romantic identity, selected leads capable of carrying its emotional contrast, and left room for the story to continue. The result is commercially understandable and dramatically coherent. The harder question is whether judging the film primarily through concerns about control misses another plausible reading. Perhaps the relationship is not meant to represent equality yet, but to dramatize the first imperfect stage of learning how to trust. A different reading begins by questioning whether Bars's rules are meant to be evaluated as a stable relationship model at all. Perhaps the film is not asking us to watch Polina exchange one hierarchy for another. Perhaps it is showing two emotionally inexperienced people using a deliberately artificial arrangement, because neither can admit what they actually need. From this perspective, the fake relationship is less a contract of ownership than a protective performance that gives both characters permission to approach each other. Polina can accept Bars's attention without immediately confessing vulnerability or attraction. Bars can remain close to her without abandoning the distant identity that supports his reputation. The rules are emotionally immature, but they provide structure where direct honesty feels impossible. Evidence for this reading appears in the gap between what the arrangement claims to be and what it becomes. If Bars wanted only obedience, Polina's resistance would make her an inconvenient choice. She argues, questions his assumptions, and refuses to behave like someone impressed by status alone. Yet that resistance is part of what keeps his attention. His attraction may not be rooted in gaining control over Polina, but in encountering someone who makes his usual control ineffective. Polina's acceptance can also be interpreted more actively. She isn't simply rescued and absorbed into Bars's identity. She uses the arrangement to change her position within the school while continuing to challenge its terms. The bargain may be unequal, yet she is not entirely without strategic purpose. She recognizes the social value of Bars's reputation and turns that value against the environment targeting her. This counterreading makes the relationship a story about negotiated trust. Bars begins with external action because action is the language he understands. He can intervene, remain present, and provide visible protection before he can articulate concern. Polina begins with suspicion because suspicion has become necessary for self-preservation. She cannot offer trust before Bars demonstrates that his attention is more reliable than the social world around them. Their friction then becomes a form of communication. Each disagreement reveals a boundary that the original arrangement failed to recognize. Each moment of concern tests whether Bars can act without demanding something in return. Each refusal tests whether Polina can oppose him without losing the connection. The relationship develops through imperfect correction rather than immediate equality. This interpretation explains why the film presents Bars's authority so attractively. His power is not merely a threat that the narrative forgets to criticize. It is the starting material of his transformation. The qualities that make him effective within the school hierarchy must be redirected rather than erased. Decisiveness can become reliability. Watchfulness can become attention. Strength can become support once it no longer requires submission. It also explains why Polina's growing attachment need not represent the loss of agency. Feeling safe with another person can help someone rebuild confidence that was damaged by isolation. Borrowed protection may be temporary scaffolding rather than permanent dependence. The decisive issue is whether Polina gradually becomes more capable of choosing, speaking, and resisting, not whether she accepted help at the beginning. This counterreading weakens the harsher claim that the film merely romanticizes control. The movie does provide evidence of movement within the relationship, and the lead performances allow sincerity to appear beneath the confrontational surface. Treating every forceful gesture as proof of manipulation would flatten bars just as surely as treating every gesture as romantic devotion. Yet the alternative reading has its own limitation. It often depends on assuming that future growth will correct what the present film leaves unresolved. Because the story is part of a larger arc, viewers may be willing to interpret imbalance as a temporary stage. A single film, however, still needs to make that transition visible enough to earn the benefit of the doubt. Intention and potential cannot replace consequences. The original reading explains the structure of power more clearly. Polina's choices are narrowed by bullying, Bars controls the terms of protection, and the film's romantic form sometimes softens that imbalance. The counterreading explains the emotional sincerity more clearly. Bars and Polina aren't coldly negotiating status. They are using familiar roles to approach feelings they cannot yet express directly. Neither interpretation fully contains the film. Seeing only control ignores the genuine connection and mutual disruption that develop between the leads. Seeing only imperfect trust ignores how strongly Polina's vulnerability shapes the bargain and how often Bars's authority remains romantically privileged. My position rests between them but leans toward caution. The relationship can be read as the beginning of growth, and the film provides enough emotional evidence to make that reading credible. Still, growth should be measured by expanded freedom. Bars becomes a better partner only when Polina can refuse him without punishment, and Polina becomes safer only when protection strengthens rather than replaces her judgment. That unresolved standard prepares the film for a second viewing. Once the initial romantic momentum is no longer the only focus, small patterns begin to matter differently. Who moves first, who watches before speaking, when Bars uses authority, and when he pauses instead, all become signals of whether the performance is becoming trust or simply acquiring deeper failing. A second viewing changes the film less through hidden objects than through changes in emphasis. The first time, attention naturally follows the central romance. When Bars appears, when Polina begins to trust him, and when their performed relationship starts carrying genuine emotion. On a rewatch, the more revealing question is what happens immediately before those moments. The film repeatedly shows pressure narrowing Polina's choices before Bars becomes the answer. This pattern begins with observation. Polina is frequently aware of being watched before she is openly challenged. A look across a shared space, the presence of a phone, or the sudden attention of nearby students can turn an ordinary moment into a threat. The social environment teaches her that visibility is dangerous. Bars initially changes that meaning. Once he is associated with her, being seen beside him can become a shield. The reversal is important because the audience may first experience his attention as uncomplicated relief. On a rewatch, attention itself becomes morally neutral. It can protect, expose, judge, or control depending on who directs it and what freedom remains. Lika watches Polina to find weakness. Bars watches to anticipate danger, but his attention can also become possessive. Polina watches everyone because she has learned that safety depends on recognizing a threat before it arrives. The phone used during public humiliation carries the same pattern in concentrated form. At first it functions as a tool of exposure, turning Polina's distress into material that can circulate beyond the moment. Later scenes of people interpreting the central relationship echo that dynamic even without recording it. Polina and Bars are continually transformed into a story told by others. Their fake relationship succeeds because the school wants a visible narrative more than it wants the truth. That makes performance the film's most important rewatch signal. Notice how often a character's behavior changes depending on who is present. Bars is harder and more economical when his reputation is being observed. Polina may become more defensive when vulnerability could be witnessed. Private moments don't simply reveal hidden feelings, they reveal how much emotional labor the public identities require. The difference between Dima and Bars also grows more meaningful. The nickname is not merely a memorable label, it separates the person from the role that gives him authority. Listen for the emotional change created when he is addressed as an individual rather than as the figure the school recognizes. The shift may be small, but it signals whether the relationship is reaching the person beneath the reputation or remaining attached to the fantasy. Movement provides another pattern. Polina's school life is shaped by fixed spaces, routines, and crowds capable of surrounding her. Bars is associated with entrances, departures, and the possibility of leaving. His motorcycle intensifies that contrast. On first viewing, movement feels romantic because it releases Polina from confinement. On a second, it is worth noticing who chooses when they leave, where they go, and when motion ends. The answer helps distinguish escape from agency. Being carried away from a hostile situation can be liberating, yet liberation remains incomplete if someone else always controls the direction. The film's quieter pauses after movement matter because they test whether Polina can occupy emotional space without borrowing Bars's momentum. Sound reinforces this distinction. Social noise can make Polina feel surrounded even when nobody is directly confronting her. Bars's arrival often narrows attention, and the motorcycle gives him a sound that announces mobility and force. More revealing are the moments when those signals disappear. Without the crowd, the engine, or the public reputation, the relationship must survive through conversation, hesitation, and listening. Performance details become richer under this lens. Bars's most meaningful changes are not necessarily his largest interventions. Watch for the moments when he stops before acting, waits for Polina's response, or allows uncertainty to remain. A pause may indicate more development than another dramatic rescue because restraint requires him to abandon the method that usually guarantees control. Polina's signals are equally subtle. Her growth is not measured only by louder defiance. It appears in whether she makes decisions before checking how others will react, whether she remains present when a conversation becomes uncomfortable, and whether her refusal sounds like self-protection or confident judgment. The difference can be carried through posture and timing rather than dialogue. The film also repeats the movement from public performance to private consequence. A social incident creates a visible role, but the emotional cost is processed later. This setup can seem like simple pacing the first time. On a rewatch, it reveals how carefully the characters separate what they display from what they feel. Their relationship becomes real in the space between those layers. These patterns reward a second viewing more through emotional design than through a complicated puzzle. The film doesn't depend on an elaborate network of concealed clues. Its value lies in watching familiar gestures change meaning. Protection can begin to resemble control, an argument can become evidence of trust, and a romantic escape can reveal another form of dependence. The decisive ending will determine which signals deserve the greatest weight. The repeated attention, the difference between Bars and Dima, the control of movement, and the growing importance of pauses all lead toward one question. When the performance can no longer protect them, do Polina and Bars choose honesty? Or do they return to the identities that made honesty feel dangerous? From this point on, the ending, the reveals, and their meaning are all on the table. If you want the film unspoiled, pause here and come back after you've seen it. Once the relationship between Polina and Bars stops being merely strategic, the film's central bargain begins to collapse. The rules were useful while both characters could pretend that their connection was a performance. Polina received protection, Bars received her cooperation, and neither had to acknowledge the emotional risk developing between them. Genuine affection makes those terms impossible to maintain because obedience and intimacy demand opposite things. The first major shift occurs when Polina publicly chooses Bars rather than simply following his arrangement. After he reacts aggressively to another incident involving her, the consequences threaten his place at school. Polina brings evidence that complicates the accusation against him and identifies him as her boyfriend through her own decision. Earlier, that label belonged to Bars because he created it. Here, Polina uses it because she wants to defend him. The event reverses their original positions. Bars once used his reputation to protect Polina from the school's judgment. Polina now uses her voice to protect him from an official judgment that sees only his reputation. She cannot erase his behavior, and the film should not ask us to ignore it, but she prevents the adults from reducing him to the identity everyone already expects. That choice is meaningful because Polina is no longer simply borrowing Bars's authority. She takes a public risk he didn't command. The relationship begins becoming mutual not when attraction appears, but when each character becomes willing to accept consequences on behalf of the other. Protection moves in both directions, even though the forms of power available to them remain different. The revelation of Bars's home life further alters the protective fantasy. He lives with an independence that initially resembles freedom, yet the absence of reliable care has forced him into premature self-sufficiency. His mother is gone, and his relationship with his influential father is shaped by secrecy, shame, and violence. The boy who controls social space at school becomes powerless during encounters with the adult whose recognition he cannot secure. This doesn't excuse Bars's controlling behavior. It explains the model of care he has inherited. Power, in his experience, is something imposed by the stronger person, while vulnerability is something concealed to avoid punishment. When he attempts to protect Polina through commands, he repeats a softened version of the structure that governs him. He may oppose his father emotionally while still reproducing the father's belief that authority creates order. Polina's presence interrupts this cycle because she sees Dima where everyone else sees Bars. Their neighboring windows become important here. The distance allows each character to be present without invading the other's room. They can communicate across separate spaces, preserving a boundary that their original bargain often lacked. The image offers a small model of healthier intimacy, connection without possession, closeness without complete access. The rescued kitten contributes to the same revelation. Bars's treatment of the animal exposes care that doesn't depend on an audience. At school, protection strengthens his reputation. At home, looking after a vulnerable creature offers no social reward. That difference suggests that his concern for Polina is not entirely another performance of dominance. The tenderness exists, even if he hasn't learned to express it consistently. Polina, meanwhile, discovers that the boy who appears self-contained is living with grief, economic pressure, and the consequences of adult abandonment. Her view of him changes from fascination with a feared figure to recognition of another isolated teenager. Their shared loneliness becomes more persuasive than the fake relationship device. Both have been placed inside new lives by adults whose decisions they cannot control, and both have developed defensive identities to survive those decisions. Their eventual romantic recognition is therefore emotionally earned at the level of performance. Zhuravleva allows Polina's guardedness to become warmer without disappearing, while Vegas lets Bars's certainty fracture around desire and fear. Their first real closeness matters because it contradicts the original contract. They are no longer together because the school must believe it. They are together because the performance has revealed feelings neither expected, yet the film deliberately keeps the old imbalance alive. Bars continues making decisions through action before discussion. Polina continues interpreting secrecy as a threat because so much of her new life has been controlled by information withheld from her. Jealousy intensifies these habits. Each character fears being less important to the other than the relationship has begun to feel, but neither possesses the emotional language to express that fear directly. The family connections surrounding Polina add another layer of concealed identity. The hostility she experiences is not generated only by Lika's jealousy or the school's appetite for cruelty. Lime, also known as Ruslan, carries resentment connected to Polina's stepfather, Polina becomes a convenient target for anger that properly belongs to an adult. She is punished for occupying a place in a family structure she didn't create. That revelation sharpens the film's argument about borrowed consequences. Polina arrives believing she can start again because nobody knows her past. Instead, she is harmed by a history she doesn't even know exists. Lime's resentment mirrors Bars's controlling behavior in a darker form. Both boys redirect pain created by their fathers toward someone with less power. Bars gradually turns toward protection, while Lime weaponizes the school hierarchy. The contrast prevents the film from treating trauma as automatic moral innocence. Pain can produce empathy, but it can also produce cruelty when a person chooses a safer target. Bars's growth becomes meaningful only when he stops transferring his fear into control over Polina. Lime's failure comes from allowing resentment to justify harming people who did not cause it. The race becomes a decisive test because it concentrates everything Bars has not yet learned. For him, dangerous competition offers money, status, adrenaline, and the temporary certainty of a world with one objective. Movement feels simpler than emotional responsibility. He tells Polina he will leave that life, but financial pressure and habit pull him back. The lie matters more than the race itself. Polina's discovery breaks the trust their relationship has slowly built. Her objection is not simply that Bars has chosen something risky. He has made a promise, hidden his decision, and assumed he could manage the consequences without including her. He once expected Polina to follow his rules while treating his own choices as exempt from mutual accountability. The relationship has become emotionally real, but his understanding of responsibility remains selective. Their confrontation before the race reveals how far they have come and how far they have not. Polina can now challenge him openly because she no longer sees protection as a debt requiring silence. Bars is emotionally affected by her judgment because she has become more than the girl he agreed to protect. Still, rather than pausing and choosing honesty, he returns to the environment where control seems achievable. His victory doesn't resolve anything. Winning only confirms that skill can produce the immediate result he wants while leaving the emotional consequence untouched. The escape from police attention continues the film's movement motif, but speed no longer feels purely liberating. It becomes avoidance. Bars can outrun an external situation for a time, yet he cannot outrun the fact that he has betrayed Polina's trust. The conflict in Polina's home then removes any illusion that adult authority is automatically safer. Her stepfather's anger turns threatening when he learns about her relationship and the changes Bars's presence has brought into the household. Polina attempts to leave, and Bars arrives during the confrontation. His intervention again protects her from immediate harm, but this time the meaning differs from the school rescue. At school, Bars's authority replaced the authority of the bullies. Inside Polina's home, he confronts an adult power structure that has repeatedly denied her agency. Polina chooses to leave with him. The act is not a perfect solution, but it belongs more clearly to her than the original bargain did. She is no longer accepting his protection because she sees no other option at school. She is rejecting a home environment that has made safety conditional on obedience. Their night together functions as an emotional pause rather than a final resolution. The accumulated performances fall away, and the two characters briefly occupy a private reality where their connection doesn't need approval from classmates, parents, or rivals. The film allows this intimacy to feel genuine, but the surrounding problems remain unresolved. Bars's father still controls part of his future. Polina's family conflict remains open. Trust has been damaged even as affection becomes undeniable. Then Bars receives the urgent call from his father. He must leave suddenly, and Polina doesn't receive a complete farewell. This is the final repetition of the pattern that has shaped their relationship. Bars acts first, information arrives later, and Polina must live with consequences she wasn't allowed to understand. The difference is that the decision now carries a scale neither character anticipates. Bars departs with his father, and news follows that their plane has crashed. Polina is left believing that Dima has died. The film moves from romantic conflict to apparent loss with deliberate cruelty. Their last unresolved tensions can no longer be repaired through another argument. The promise of future honesty becomes impossible, and the nickname, the rules, the jealousy, and the race suddenly feel small beside the absence. The airplane resolves a motif that has been connected to change from the beginning. Earlier, flight suggests distance, possibility, and the hope that movement leads toward something better. The final crash turns that symbol against Polina. Change no longer carries her toward renewal. It removes the person who made the new city emotionally survivable. This is where the title fully declares itself. Polina's heart is not broken only because she loses a boyfriend. It breaks because the relationship had become evidence that her new life could contain something other than humiliation and control. Bars was flawed and their connection remained unequal, but he had also seen her, defended her, and allowed himself to be seen in return. His disappearance makes every unfinished part of the relationship permanent in her mind. The loss also tests whether Polina's growth belonged to her or depended entirely on Bars. When bullying threatens her and Dilara again, Bars is no longer available to change the room. The old social order attempts to reassert itself as though his absence has removed Polina's right to resist. This is the harshest test of the original bargain. If protection created only dependence, she should return to the powerless position she occupied at the beginning. Instead, the conflict eventually reaches the authorities, and police intervention helps stabilize the situation. The resolution may be less emotionally satisfying than watching Bars enter and frighten everyone away, but that is precisely why it matters. A social problem should not require possession by a stronger teenager to become manageable. Polina and Dilara's survival begins moving from personal protection toward accountable intervention. Polina then decides to leave for her grandmother's home. The departure can look like retreat, yet it also represents a choice made after the identities of the new city have collapsed around her. She is no longer only the newcomer, the target, or Bars's supposed girlfriend. She leaves carrying grief, but she also carries a greater awareness of what she can refuse and whom she can trust. The final train scene reopens everything the crash appeared to settle. Looking through the window, Polina sees a man who resembles Bars. The film refuses to confirm whether the figure is truly him, a stranger briefly shaped by grief, or a visual promise that the story is not finished. The uncertainty is deliberate. Polina has spent the film looking through windows at a boy whose private reality was always partly hidden. Now the window offers one more image she cannot fully verify. If the figure is Bars, then his apparent death belongs to a larger deception connected to his father's dangerous world. His disappearance becomes the ultimate version of protection without consent. Polina may have been kept away from the truth for her safety, but the emotional cost is devastating. Once again, someone else decides what she is allowed to know and calls the result necessary. If the figure is only a stranger, the scene remains psychologically credible. Grief teaches the eye to search for the missing person in crowds, reflections, and passing shapes. Polina's uncertainty would then express the mind's refusal to accept an absence that arrived without a body, farewell, or complete explanation. The film preserves hope while showing how hope can prevent grief from settling. Knowledge that the literary story continues makes survival the likely direction, but the first film itself stops at uncertainty. That decision is commercially useful because it creates demand for the sequel. Dramatically, it is more complicated. The open ending gives the airplane motif, the windows, and Bars's secretive family history a final point of convergence. It also denies Polina and the viewer a complete emotional resolution. The rewatch signals now become legible. Windows repeatedly offer connection while maintaining separation. Planes repeatedly connect movement with irreversible change. Bars's nickname protects the private Dima until Polina reaches him, while his final disappearance returns him to an image she cannot access. Movement begins as fantasy, becomes avoidance during the race, and ends as loss through the flight and uncertainty through the train. The ending answers the deep view question only partially. Bars's protection is neither a simple escape from power nor merely another form of it. His presence helps Polina resist a hostile environment, and their genuine affection gives both characters a reason to move beyond their defensive roles. Yet he never fully learns to separate care from secrecy and control before he disappears. The relationship offers transformation, but it doesn't complete it. My final analytical judgment is that the film earns its heartbreak more convincingly than it earns its romance as an equal partnership. The chemistry, shared isolation, and gradual movement from performance to genuine feeling create an emotional bond worth investing in. The surrounding melodrama sometimes simplifies the path, and Bars's development remains unfinished, but the ending gives those limitations thematic weight. His inability to communicate openly becomes not just a recurring flaw, but the form of Polina's final wound. What remains after the plot is explained is not the motorcycle, the school confrontation, or even the report of the plane crash. It is Polina sitting beside the train window and seeing a familiar shape where certainty should be. The image lasts because it contains two incompatible needs. She needs to grieve the person she believes she has lost, but she also needs to believe that the story has not finished without her consent. The window returns the relationship to one of its earliest visual conditions. Polina and Dima once communicated across the distance between neighboring homes. They could see each other while remaining physically separate, close enough for connection but far enough for misunderstanding. In the final scene, another pane of glass divides Polina from the figure outside. The distance is larger now, and the possibility of error is greater, but the emotional structure remains the same. She sees something that may be Dima without gaining access to the truth behind the image. That uncertainty is more affecting than a simple confirmation would have been. If Bars clearly appeared alive, grief would immediately become suspense. If the film confirmed his death, hope would disappear and the ending would become a closed tragedy. Instead, Polina is left between interpretations, and the viewer must briefly occupy the same unstable emotional space. The human question beneath that image concerns what people do with an unfinished relationship. Polina and Bars reached genuine affection, but they didn't resolve the habits that threatened it. He continued hiding choices and confusing protection with authority. She continued struggling to distinguish independence from the fear of needing someone. Their bond became real just as the opportunity to repair it disappeared. Loss often fixes a person in the version we knew last. There can be no further argument, apology, disappointment, or growth. The missing person becomes memory, and memory is shaped by whatever remained unsaid. Polina is therefore grieving more than Bars. She is grieving the future in which their connection might have become healthier than its beginning. The film grows slightly after reflection because its flaws begin interacting with its ending. Bars's incomplete development initially feels like a weakness in the romance. After his disappearance, that incompleteness becomes the point. He doesn't leave as a fully transformed partner. He leaves as someone who had begun changing, but still relied on secrecy, risk, and unilateral decisions. The pain comes partly from the possibility that he might have learned more if time had allowed it. Polina's growth also becomes clearer after the immediate melodrama settles. She begins the story hoping to avoid attention and survive until she can leave. By the end, she has defended Bars publicly, challenged his dishonesty, resisted the authority inside her home, and faced renewed hostility without disappearing into the role of helpless victim. Her development is uneven, but it belongs to her. The film shrinks when reflection exposes how often supporting characters function as instruments rather than people. The bullying, family hostility, jealousy, and hidden connections repeatedly arrive at the precise moment the central romance needs pressure. That construction gives the story energy, but it reduces the sense that Polina and Bars inhabit a fully independent world. Their relationship receives emotional detail that several surrounding conflicts lack. The final ambiguity also carries a commercial calculation. A figure resembling Bars invites continuation and prevents the apparent tragedy from becoming absolute. Knowing that the story extends beyond this film makes the uncertainty less mysterious. Yet the image still works within the first movie because it doesn't merely tease survival. It returns Polina to the act of looking and asks whether love can ever provide certainty when the person being loved controls what can be known. Our original question was whether Bars's protection frees Polina from power or places her inside a more seductive version of it. The film's answer is that it does both. His presence protects her from immediate cruelty, helps her recover confidence, and creates a connection neither character expected. His methods also preserve inequality through rules, secrecy, and decisions made on her behalf. The relationship becomes meaningful when it begins outgrowing those terms. Polina protects Bars with her own voice. Dima allows parts of his private self to become visible. Their assigned roles start giving way to recognition. The movement is genuine, but it remains incomplete when the plane takes him away. That incompleteness is the film's most honest quality. Love doesn't erase the habits people developed before meeting each other. It reveals those habits and raises the cost of refusing to change them. Polina and Bars don't prove that affection solves power. They demonstrate that affection can make power impossible to ignore. After everything has been measured, my personal score for your heart will be broken is 5.2 out of 10. That number reflects a film with an effective emotional center, committed young leads, and a final image stronger than several of the plot mechanisms used to reach it. It also reflects serious limitations in character balance, supporting development, and the framing of romantic control. Its greatest achievement is the chemistry between Veronika Zhuravleva and Daniel Vegas. Their contrast gives familiar material enough tension to remain watchable. Polina's guarded reactions and Bars's controlled presence create a believable progression from irritation and necessity toward concern. Even when the screenplay uses recognizable devices, the performers help the emotions feel specific to these characters. The film also understands the fantasy it is delivering. It doesn't apologize for being a heightened young adult melodrama, and it doesn't bury the central relationship beneath unnecessary self-awareness. For viewers who already love Anna Jane's story or who enjoy protective antiheroes, school rivalry, fake relationships, and emotionally turbulent first love, that sincerity may matter more than originality. The limitation affecting the score most is that the film doesn't consistently distinguish Bars becoming more loving from Bars becoming less controlling. His feelings deepen and his vulnerability becomes visible, but the relationship needs more moments in which he respects Polina's choice without first creating the terms. The film recognizes the problem, yet it often returns to romantic intensity before the consequences have done enough work. The supporting world lowers the score as well. Lika, Lime, the parents, classmates, and institutional figures create pressure efficiently, but several of their threads feel compressed or arranged around the central pair. The bullying deserves a more developed social context, while the family revelations require greater space to become fully persuasive. A score of 5.2 is not a claim of objective value. Viewers invested in the source novel may reasonably respond much more strongly, because they bring existing knowledge of the characters and understand this film as the first movement of a longer arc. Viewers with little patience for possessive romance may score it lower because the film's central fantasy is also its central ethical weakness. The movie is best suited to streaming for most viewers. Its intimate scale, familiar structure, and performance-led appeal don't require a theatrical environment to remain effective. A cinema audience of devoted book fans may benefit from the collective reaction to the romantic turns and cliffhanger, but the film's craft doesn't consistently demand a large screen. Its rewatch value is moderate and audience-dependent. Fans of Polina and Bars may return for their chemistry, the neighboring window exchanges, and the early signals connected to Dima's family and disappearance. A second viewing can clarify the pattern of observation, movement, and secrecy. Viewers who found the supporting conflicts mechanical are unlikely to discover enough additional complexity to transform their judgment. The recommendation is therefore selective. Watch it if you enjoy emotionally direct youth melodramas and can engage with a romantic fantasy while still questioning its imbalance. It may also be worthwhile for viewers interested in popular book adaptations and the way older bad boy conventions are being renegotiated for a contemporary audience. If you need subtle social realism, strongly developed secondary characters, or a romance grounded in equality from the beginning, this is unlikely to satisfy you. The film deserves credit for creating a relationship worth debating rather than one that disappears as soon as the plot ends. Its best moments allow attraction and discomfort to exist together. Its weaker moments confuse that discomfort with proof of passion. The ending preserves both responses, leaving Polina with hope while refusing to guarantee that hope will lead to repair. If this deeper look gave you a new way to read Polina and Bars, you can like the video and subscribe to continue exploring films through character, craft, and meaning. Do you believe the man Polina sees from the train is truly Bars, or is the image created by grief and her refusal to accept an unfinished goodbye? And looking honestly at their relationship, did Bars help Polina become freer, or did the film romanticize his control more than it challenged it? Whatever your answer, the most revealing part may be why the film makes us want him to return even after showing us how much he still needs to change. That conflict is where your heart will be broken finds its strongest idea. A heart can survive being broken, but rebuilding it requires more than recovering what was lost. It requires deciding what deserves to return. Cinema Deep View, look closer, and the movie changes.